worst moments of your life are not the loud ones. They are not the arguments, the losses, the failures, the visible crises that everyone can see and respond to. Those moments are tolerable because they are shared, because others are present to help you process them, because the specific pain has an audience and therefore a witness. The worst moments are the quiet ones, the 3 a.m. moments when there is no one to hide from and no performance to maintain. The moments in solitude when the constructed self you have been presenting all day finally goes silent and something older surfaces. Something that has been waiting beneath the construction for decades, patient and hungry, for the specific conditions that produce its appearance. You know these moments. You have been avoiding them for years. Schopenhauer observed that the measure of a man's genuine psychological development is what he becomes in solitude, not what he projects in company, not what he performs in front of mirrors of approval, what emerges when there is no one to register the emergence. Most men fail this measurement completely. They discover, when forced into solitude, that there is no man there, only the collapsed infrastructure of someone who has been maintained entirely by external feedback. What follows are 5 cold truths about solitude. Each of them describes a specific mechanism that operates when a man is alone with himself for long enough, and why most men have organized their lives to ensure that mechanism never activates. Cold truth. Number 1. The self you meet in solitude is the self everyone else has been protecting you from. When you are around other people, even passive company, even background noise, even the ambient awareness that someone could observe you at any moment, you are operating as the social self, the constructed version, the persona that has been trained over decades to respond to the presence of witnesses. This persona feels so continuously present that most men mistake it for their identity. It is not. It is the response to external conditions. When those conditions are removed, when the witnesses genuinely disappear, when the performance has no audience, when the psychological cost of producing the persona finally exceeds the energy available, something else appears, and the something else is almost always unrecognizable to the man experiencing it. Jung understood this with clinical precision. The persona covers the genuine self so completely that most men spend their entire adult lives never encountering the actual human being beneath the construction. The construction is not evil. It is efficient. It handles the daily requirements of social navigation with such reliability that the genuine self becomes atrophied through disuse. And when solitude strips the persona away, the man meets a stranger, the stranger he actually is, and finds that stranger unbearable. This is why most men cannot tolerate extended solitude. The discomfort is not boredom. It is existential confrontation. The specific experience of meeting the self you have been suppressing for decades and having no idea what to do with him. And because the encounter is unbearable, most men immediately reintroduce distraction. The phone, the noise, the return to company, the manufactured presence of witnesses that allows the persona to reactivate and the stranger to disappear back into the basement where he has been kept. Most men call this preference for company their sociability. It is not. It is their specific inability to tolerate their own company, because their own company has been unfamiliar to them for most of their life. Cold truth number 2. Solitude is where your unexamined wounds begin to speak. The psychological material you have been carrying, the specific griefs that were never fully processed, the betrayals that were never fully faced, the losses that were quietly set aside, all of this exists inside you whether you examine it or not. It does not disappear through neglect. It accumulates. And in the presence of continuous stimulation and company, it stays dormant. It waits. Solitude is the condition under which this material activates. Marcus Aurelius understood that the mind left alone with itself begins processing what has been postponed, not by the man's choice, automatically. The psyche has its own mechanisms for metabolizing buried experience, and those mechanisms require specific conditions to operate. Silence, stillness, the absence of external input that would otherwise occupy the same psychological bandwidth. Most men have never provided these conditions for long enough to experience the processing. They have reached the initial discomfort, the specific heaviness that begins when the mind starts surfacing what it has been holding, and they have immediately interrupted the process. They have introduced new stimulation. They have called someone. They have opened something. They have redirected their attention to anything other than what was attempting to surface. The interruption does not cancel the processing. It postpones it. The material that was rising continues to exist. It returns to dormancy, and the cost of the postponement accumulates with every additional interruption. You have been carrying postponed processing for decades, every unexamined wound from every period of your life, all of it waiting for the specific solitude that would allow it to finally complete. You have been systematically preventing that solitude because somewhere beneath conscious awareness, you have known what would rise if you stopped. Cold truth number 3. The men who cannot be alone are the men who will never know themselves. Self-knowledge does not emerge in company. It is not produced through conversation. Other people can reflect you back to yourself, can challenge your self-image, can provide information you would not otherwise access. But the deep work of knowing yourself is work that only occurs when you are alone, long enough for the social self to dissolve and the actual self to become observable. Nietzsche understood this distinction completely. He saw that most men operate with what he called borrowed identities, selves constructed from inherited values, external approval, social position. These identities function perfectly within their original contexts. They collapse in genuine solitude, because genuine solitude removes every external reference point the borrowed identity was depending on for its sense of reality. The man who cannot tolerate solitude is announcing, without realizing it, that his identity is borrowed, that there is no internal source from which his sense of self is generated, that without the continuous reinforcement of external conditions, he does not know who he is, because the who he is has never existed independently of those conditions. This is not a minor limitation. It is a structural failure of the self. The man with an internally generated identity can be alone for extended periods without disintegrating, because his sense of self does not require external confirmation to remain stable. The man with a borrowed identity fragments the moment the external confirmation stops arriving, and he experiences the fragmentation as a crisis produced by solitude, when the actual crisis is that solitude is revealing what was always true, that there was no genuine self to disintegrate in the first place. Most men never develop an internally generated identity. They live their entire lives dependent on external input to maintain a coherent sense of who they are. And they mistake this dependence for normalcy because almost everyone around them is operating the same way. Cold truth number 4. The specific thoughts you have at 3 in the morning are the truest thoughts you are capable of. Not because the thoughts themselves are more accurate, but because the conditions that produce them have stripped away the filters that would normally edit them before they reached awareness. At 3 in the morning, in genuine solitude with exhaustion-lowering psychological defenses, with no social context requiring the maintenance of any particular self-image, the mind produces content that bypasses the usual editing. This content is not always correct. It can be distorted by exhaustion, by mood, by the specific psychological state that produces 3 in the morning wakefulness. But it is the content closest to the actual machinery of your mind. It is what your mind produces when the performance infrastructure is offline. And it reveals, with uncomfortable precision, what the performance has been covering. Schopenhauer observed that the will, the pre-rational drive beneath conscious thought, produces its actual agenda most visibly in these unguarded moments. The specific anxieties, the specific longings, the specific assessments of your own life that your conscious mind would never permit to surface in daylight conditions. All of this surfaces automatically when the conditions no longer support the suppression. You know what your 3 in the morning thoughts contain. You have been having them for years, and you have been systematically dismissing them, telling yourself they are distortions produced by fatigue, that they do not reflect your real perspective, that the daylight version of yourself is the accurate one. The opposite is closer to the truth. The daylight version is the edited version. The 3 in the morning version is the raw material the editing has been processing. And the fact that you have been dismissing the raw material for years does not mean it has been inaccurate. It means you have been unable to sit with what it has been telling you. Cold truth number 5. The man who finally tolerates his own solitude becomes ungovernable. This is the final truth, and it is why most men will never develop the capacity, because the capacity for genuine solitude produces a specific independence that the social environment is structured to prevent. The man who can be alone with himself no longer requires continuous social reinforcement to maintain his identity. He no longer responds to the standard pressures that shape compliance. He no longer needs what everyone around him needs, and that needlessness makes him unpredictable. Machiavelli understood that the most difficult man to manipulate is the man who does not require external validation, because the entire system of social leverage depends on the threat of withdrawal, the implicit message that the group's approval, attention, and inclusion can be adjusted based on the man's behavior. This threat has no weight against a man who has developed the capacity to sit with himself without the group's reinforcement. He simply does not care at the specific level where the leverage would need to operate. This is not antisocial behavior. It is psychological independence. The man who has developed it continues to engage with others when engagement serves genuine purpose. But his engagement is no longer driven by the fear of being alone. And the absence of that fear changes every dynamic he participates in. Most men never reach this state because reaching it requires passing through the specific discomfort that the earlier truths described, meeting the stranger beneath the persona, allowing the unexamined wounds to speak, developing an internally generated identity, sitting with the 3 a.m. thoughts without running from them. Each of these is its own confrontation, and each of them produces temporary conditions that are intensely unpleasant. The men who run from the confrontation never develop the capacity. The men who endure it develop a specific kind of sovereignty that cannot be granted by anyone else and cannot be taken away by the standard social mechanisms. You have not developed this sovereignty. Your daily pattern of continuous stimulation, continuous company, continuous avoidance of genuine solitude is the specific evidence that you have not. And the pattern is not accidental. It is protecting you from the confrontation that would produce the sovereignty, at the cost of ever becoming the kind of man who possesses it. Most men will maintain this pattern for their entire lives. They will die without ever having spent more than a few hours genuinely alone with themselves. They will leave behind the external achievements and the managed relationships and the carefully maintained persona, and there will be no internal self to be remembered, because no internal self was ever developed. You are currently on this trajectory. The pattern is not hypothetical. It is the specific shape of how you currently live. The phone is in reach. The company is scheduled. The continuous filling of silence has been operating for so long, you no longer recognize it as avoidance. The solitude is waiting for you. It has been waiting for decades. And it will continue waiting until you stop arranging your life to prevent its arrival, or until external circumstances finally produce it, whether you wanted it or not. Most men only encounter it at the end, when the specific conditions of terminal illness, profound loss, or forced isolation finally strip away the infrastructure they have been using to prevent it. And at that point, the genuine confrontation arrives with compounded interest. Everything that was postponed arrives at once, and there is no longer time to process it. You will encounter your solitude eventually. The only question is whether you encounter it while there is still time to become the man who can survive it, or whether you encounter it too late to matter.